When we're talking MartinLogan, you're going to see a tagline we use pretty commonly called truth and sound, right? And that's kind of a philosophy we believe in. So on today's introduction to electrostatic loudspeakers, we're going to kind of cover that a little bit as well. So truth and sound, kind of our intent is to bring the listener closer to the artist's actual original intent since about 1983. Our speaker company actually predates my being alive. So we have been around for quite a long time in terms of that. ESL products in general have actually been around for quite a bit longer. I know it seems like something that might seem kind of space aged in terms of that, but they've actually been being developed since about the 1920s. How they've kind of grown as time has gone on, it's changed quite a bit. From the first, I should say, the first types of ESLs kind of shared a little bit of technology with what was essentially early sausage casings. So we were using some things for the thin film that we wouldn't want to use in today's market, essentially. From there, we went into about 1950, and then a company called Quad had came out. Something you guys might be one of the grandfathers of ESL, essentially. And they used a different type of panel in terms of setup. We actually still have a set of them in Lawrence, in fact. So they were kind of more popular. However, they had some specific instances where they could kind of have some problems. So as time went on, we wanted to kind of create our own version. So one of the key things is we wanted to eliminate sources of distortion and sound coloration to preserve the original intent of the recording. And this is something that kind of the technology for ESL allows us to do very simply. And I'll kind of explain that as we go on. We want to achieve the most accurate sonic reproduction across multiple system applications through successful implementation of thin film technologies. So essentially what this is kind of saying is as we kind of grew, we wanted to take the ESL technology and be able to utilize it for everything into centers and things like that, right? And then we wanted to use the unique advantages of ESL and our folded motion technology to deliver the best real world results in your listening room. We're going to focus on ESL today, but I do want to touch a little bit on the folded motion just when it comes to the center channels and our products as well. Because it's important to understand kind of why we make design choices we've done with our ESL panels. So, we won't spend too much time on company history for you, but 1983, you're going to see Ron and Gail there. Those are our two founders. So Gail Martin Saunders and Ron Logan Sutherland. We're a big fan of middle names in this company. So in that case, you're going to see an original product they created and brought to CES. These were called the monoliths at that point in time. Interesting story on them. The first issue we really had was arcing on our panels. So because there are two active stators on either side and then a positively charged film, we had to make sure you couldn't complete the circuit. So Ron and Gail brought their first speaker to CES, were absolutely wowing people. And then about 45 minutes later, it arced and, kind of poof, it went essentially. That being said, though, they'd already gotten so much interest in it that they were able to kind of keep going with the company in terms of it. So fast forward about 3 years, and after the monolith, we kind of developed what was called the CLS series speaker, and this was kind of a large single transducer in terms of that too, so a pure ESL panel. And then since then, we've kind of had a real following in terms of the electrostatic community and loudspeakers in general. In 1994, as mentioned, right, we kind of went into different form factors. So we tried to create our first ESL center channel, the Logos, which was kind of designed, obviously, to take advantage of that home theater boom. One of the things we're really well known for is we create what's called a hybrid electrostatic speaker. So because of that, we have a lot of technology and a lot of specialty in terms of integrating subwoofers. So we thought, why not make a standalone sub? We're already able to match the speed and finesse of a panel to an actual traditional woofer. People might just want to see that in a woofer itself. And then everywhere from architectural products to some of our folded motion products that kind of give a similar technology, just in different applications, and then all the way into producing some things like electronics as well for us. So what makes our signature sound quality possible? Like most speaker companies, right, as we get higher up into the ranges, we want rigid and lightweight drivers for fast and linear sound production. We want durable internally braced speaker enclosures that minimize resonance and coloration. And then we want advanced crossover circuits utilizing the highest quality of components to minimize distortion and loss of detail. These sound pretty familiar, right? These are the same kind of tenets you're going to see off most high quality speakers, essentially. The difference is in terms of how we implement them and the materials we use. So that comes to the thin film sound advantage. And with us, this is both our folded motion tweeters, which essentially are an air motion transformer. Some people sometimes think they're a ribbon, versus our electrostatic speakers or our transducers in that regard. So on the panels themselves. So the acceleration of an object depends on the mass of the object and the amount of force applied to steal Sir Isaac Newton's quote there. So the lighter mass of a loudspeaker diaphragm has, the faster and more precise it can react to the incoming source signal it's asked to reproduce. And the result of that, no details left behind. I know a lot of you are going to be in the UK, so apologies if you're not particularly big Mercedes Formula One fans on this one. So how do traditional speakers work? I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, right? That's going to be essentially an essential traditional woofer. We're going to energize a voice coil through a magnet's gap, and then it's going to basically couple the air essentially in front of it, push and pull. In terms of this, we still use this as well. So part of our hybrid design is we are going to have a traditional woofer, but there are some drawbacks to a traditional woofer, right? In one case, we have inertia we have to overcome. So in terms of being able to track a signal perfectly, even with magnetic field, it's going to be challenging to start and stop that pistonic movement quite simply. So that makes it one aspect that's a little bit more challenging. We also have instances too where sound can we can essentially have issues with cone uniformity, things where distortion essentially are added. So how does an ESL work and how does it kind of counter these types of things? So Martin-Logan ESLs are, pardon me, are plasma bonded on our diaphragms. So in most cases, when we talk about a speaker diaphragm, we want something that's very light, that's very rigid, and that generally doesn't have a lot of resonance in it, right? Usually when we get this is we move up through our chain of products, and you can see this even when we look at things like our motion lineup of products, you're getting more exotic materials, right? Some companies will use diamond, some companies will use beryllium in terms of it, things like that. Usually, the higher up you go, the more expensive the material goes. In our case, we chose to use something a little different. So when we're talking about an ESL speaker, we're going to use a diaphragm that's essentially mylar. It's 12 microns thick, so it's about 8 times thinner than a human hair. It's the lightest material used in speakers. So in fact, it's actually lighter than the air it's displacing while moving. So because of that, it's very easy to control, right? We have no mass or inertia to overcome, resulting in pure sonic accuracy with no lag or distortion. When we look at that stator, it kind of breaks down into multiple parts, or I should say the panel. The stators are the front and back micro perf, almost screen door looking pieces on there. They're going to have a positive or negative charge to them, depending on what the amplifier is feeding it. Then you're going to have essentially your middle portion there is your plasma bonded diaphragm, which is a thin piece of mylar film that we essentially have coated with a conductive material. And then in addition to that, as I mentioned, right, the first ESLs we produced had problems with arcing. So we wanted to make sure that we overcame that issue. So in this case, what we've got is we have these clear spar spacers. These spacers are designed to make sure that we don't ever complete the circuit, so that middle film doesn't completely touch one side or the other. In addition to that, they're actually set up at different spots throughout the panel. Some people have a misconception that that might be something like a tuning specifically for different frequency ranges. That's not actually the case. What it's essentially designed for is to protect it from completing that circuit. In addition to that, we place them in specific areas to make sure that we don't have any unwanted resonances. So kind of to tune them out in that regard. The entire panel itself can play the range from essentially 20 to around 250 to 400 hertz, depending. So we don't actually need a crossover for that aspect as well. Our plasma bonded diaphragm in this case is always positively charged. So you will notice with Martin-Logan speakers, whether we're talking about a masterpiece product that is hybrid amplified or we're talking a completely passive speaker, they will all require power for them. The reasoning behind that is we're going to have to charge that plasma bonded diaphragm. And then in addition to that, any other speaker information is going to be stepped up in terms of a transformer so that we can then actually control that diaphragm incredibly quickly. So inside an ESL, trying to give you an example of how it works, right? So you're going to see essentially the inside of how that diaphragm is going to work, that Martin-Logan X-Stat panel. So as we go plus or minus, we're going to push or pull that diaphragm towards, kind of similar to what we would see in a traditional speaker, right? In this case, though, and this is where ESLs are quite a bit different than most, oftentimes they get compared to magneplanars and things like that. We're actually not going to use a magnetic field at all in this case. So that's entirely done through push and pull of the electrostatic field. Because of that, there's no real inertia and it's incredibly quick to change direction. So it tends to create what we like to consider almost the panel magic effect. Um, MartinLogans and electrostats in general are incredibly revealing speakers, and we're able to track an original signal source pretty much 100%, right? So we take our high volt power supply, sends information into that high volt bias. So essentially that plus or minus in terms of this. In this case, we're looking at just energizing that diaphragm itself positively. Our amplifier itself is going to send information through crossover up into an audio transformer. It's then going to step up the voltage. So one thing about our products, in addition to that, we do have to step up the voltage overall. So it's several thousand volts in terms of what we're actually using for the stators. The stators are all actually coated though with an insulated material in terms of it, so there's no risk or concern about touching them in terms of that stuff. And then in addition to that, once they go through that transformer, we kind of knock out all the amperage and current to it. So they are high volt, but there's very low possibility of shock in terms of it as well too. And then because of that, again with that coating, which was developed in conjunction with 3M, we don't have any issues in terms of hands wandering towards the stators themselves. So fully safe in that regard, fully quickly and to use. In addition to that, we also couple that with a dynamic woofer as well. And the reason we do that is that with any electrostatic speaker, it gets to a point where, and this was kind of the original key issues with electrostats, were tended to be that they, A, kind of had a head and a vice kind of idea. So you only had one defined sweet spot. And B, they tended to have problems doing more dynamic range, so lower in terms of the bass register. Um, the reasoning behind that is you need a very big panel to be able to play all the way down to 20. So what we've done in this case is we've kind of MartinLogan existed to kind of create or to change these issues, or I should say to overcome these issues. So one of the things we had done in terms of it is added that dynamic woofer, and we'll talk about that, and we'll talk a little bit about our curved linear line source array as well, which is kind of how we've been able to improve the overall dispersion of the speaker as well. So we talked a little bit, right, about cone versus dome versus ESL panels. So one of the benefits, and we talk about truth and sound, we don't want any distortion. We want to make sure that we maintain the original artist's intent. So you're going to see a conventional driver there. So on your left, so due to the combined mass of the driver, the dust cap, the voice coil, traditional cones tend to be less responsive to audio signals. And because of that, they suffer from lag essentially. So audio lag smears the detail in the original master recording. So as you can see there, right, we're given the signal originally, and then it's slightly colored by the actual woofer itself. These aren't huge differences in terms of it, but there is a notable difference in terms of the signal that's been given and then how it can reproduce it in the same timing sphere. When we look at an ESL for this example, because we don't have any mass and then therefore no inertia to really overcome, the ESL diaphragm reproduces every detail of the incoming signal precisely. So to give another example of this, personally, I had done the Montreal Audio Fest, sort of been 2 years ago, and we had a pair of Expression 13As. The dealer had a friend who was a professional harpist, so they had came in with their harp, put a backing track on, and played a live performance, and it almost sounded seamless. If any of you have ever encountered live music or seen anyone play with a backing track off a traditional stereo, usually it's pretty easy to localize the difference in that case. We had her set up kind of directly in the middle. The ESLs were set up so the sweet spot was perfect for the listening area, and it all was one coherent performance, which was pretty impressive to say the least. So when we talk about ESLs, we kind of have our 4 Ls when we design and build an ESL. So we want the lightest driver material. The lighter the driver is, the faster and more accurate it can react to the audio signal. We're looking for linear and uniform movement as well, right? So because we are so light and don't suffer from inertia, in addition to that too, we have all those spars. We kind of control the throw essentially of that panel. So the entire ESL diaphragm surface is driven uniformly, unlike a voice coil system. So this eliminates motion-induced surface distortion. So we energize the entire panel itself, not just a section of it. In addition to that, we have the largest surface area. So I'm sure many of you have listened to vehicle stereo systems or seen a small micro speaker, and unfortunately, it just tends to be the case that a tweeter and a 3-inch driver generally can't keep up with a multi-driver, multi 8 inches and a 6.5-inch mid-range, and things like that. In our case, we're going to have substantially more surface area than all of those. So even if you add up all the surface area you would see on a very large speaker, it's still going to pale in comparison to the largest ESLs. We're going to show you that momentarily. And then addition to that, if we were going to build a perfect speaker, ideally we'd want no crossover at all, right? We don't want any weak links in the chain. That being said, because of the nature of how our products work, we still do need to cross over to that hybrid bass driver. But in doing so, we actually keep crossovers away from the critical mid-range range for most people. So essentially like 2K to 5K, anywhere from around 1K all the way up to about 5K in that range, essentially. These are generally where most of our conversations have and most of the music we listen to ends up coming into. So by not having a crossover in that range, we tend to get a little bit cleaner signal overall. Just to give you an example of how important those ranges are too, if you look at your iPhone for an example, and the microphone on your iPhone actually generally isn't sensitive above 2K, that's why oftentimes you'll be, walking past and there's an emergency vehicle siren or something like that that will be deafening to you, but maybe the person on the phone can't hear it. The microphone's not sensitive to pick those up just because that isn't really within human speech patterns. So kind of how that works in that regard. So I want to talk a little bit about controlled dispersion. The biggest thing about electrostats is how we limit room interaction. So they take the bad acoustics out of the equation. And this is a big thing for us. So when we talk about a normal cone and dome speaker, they have very wide dispersion. There's benefits to this obviously in cases too. Makes it a little easier from a sweet spot perspective depending, but there's performance trade-offs. So we get less direct sound and more reflected. So because of that, we get more blurry imaging and exaggerated soundstage. And our mid-range is a bit more muddy and less clear. What's happening there is that sounds are actually radiating off the wall before it would be considered the ideal first point of reflection. So we're kind of getting them arriving at our ears at different times. That kind of causes confusion to our brains, and that's kind of why we have trouble hearing in certain cases. So again, when we talk about cone and dome, we have floor bounce reflections, ceiling bounce reflections, which cause incoherence in dialogue and vocals as well. And that's just kind of the nature how it works, right? When we talk about a tweeter, generally that's going to radiate forward. We talk about bass, it's going to radiate 360 degrees. But it causes our brain to have a lot more work to do to try to determine what sound was actually intended. That kind of becomes the magic of controlled dispersion with thin film speakers. So we have significantly more focused and controlled sound to hit the listener's ear before the surface reflection occurs. And we do this in a couple different ways. So our folded motion tweeters, which we do use on our center channels, as mentioned before, the reason I kind of wanted to point this out is generally you need a very large panel to be able to reproduce the full range up to 20,000. So in some cases, when it comes to centers, we actually have a panel that will produce a certain range, generally the mid-range. And then for higher frequencies, anything above 5K, we have a folded motion tweeter. That kind of allows us to kind of fill that gap and make sure that we can provide adequate sound for everything. The benefit of the folded motion too is it's still a thin film technology and it's still very controlled, so it mats or marries very well with our traditional ESL. So when we look at a folded motion tweeter, we're now getting about 80 by 80 for dispersion. So again, not nearly as bad as the 120 or 180 by 180 we'd see on a traditional dome tweeter. So we do get a more controlled but wider sweet spot in those cases. We also have a folded motion XT, which is a bit bigger. That even further limits the actual interaction between ceiling and floor. So as we go, we kind of are narrowing our window slightly as well. And then finally, we get to our electrostatic panels. So the big benefit on an electrostatic panel is essentially you're not getting really any floor or ceiling interaction in the listening area. As you kind of notice there, it's almost like as opposed to having pot light or directed light, ambient lighting in the room, you almost have direct spotlight in terms of what you're looking at. So all the energy is focused directly to where you're listening, and it drastically reduces room interactions. So in the case of our products, and this was kind of how one of the other issues with early ESLs. So primarily with early ESLs, the issue was that they had a head and device idea. So as you mentioned, you might have seen there in the video, or sorry, as you might have seen there in the examples earlier, it's very controlled. We have a 30-degree curve built into our panels that allow us to actually give a wider sweet spot overall. So that way you can get a great listening experience across, 4 rows of seating without hearing a lot of wall interactions. In the case of any kind of floor or ceiling interactions, those are pretty much removed entirely because we're only hearing content from the width, I should say, the height of the panel. So it's being directed directly at you, and most of our products are slightly raked forward, or I should say raked back, or directly straight, depending on the application. Now, in this case, obviously, we still do have instances where you might be saying, well, that's great, Brandon, but you have a traditional woofer. So wouldn't that cause some issues for you as well? And yes, normally it would, right? One of the biggest advantages we've had to MartinLogan as a company is quite a few years ago now, in kind of the mid 90s, or no, sorry, I should say the 2000s. MartinLogan was purchased along with Paradigm and Anthem by a third-party company, kind of a venture capitalist fund, and it kind of brought us all together as a group. One of the neat things about that is that Anthem had Anthem room correction or Arc Genesis capabilities. So we were able to take all that we had learned on the ESLs in terms of making sure that we don't have to apply essentially correction to most of the range, and then apply it exclusively to that woofer cabinet. So it's kind of been neat to be able to see that in terms of it. So with ARC, we can take a live reading of your room. And in this case, it's interesting too, because the nice thing about an ESL speaker is if you have a customer who maybe isn't a fan of the idea of correction or digital processing, you're not really applying it into the ranges where they're going to audibly hear. You're going to only really apply it into the areas where the room is going to drastically affect it. So because from essentially, 250 to 4K are up, or sorry, 250 to 400 or up, I should say, in the frequency range, we don't really have that. You can kind of go completely through. So essentially what we're going to do with ARC is we're going to place our speakers and set them up. And then from there, we're going to run the calibration, and it's going to basically adjust us for the positioning of those woofer cabinets. So it's quite helpful in that regard. So you can kind of see that's an example of what your wave would look like. That's the target curve, so kind of taking some of that volatility out of that. And we do that by applying an inverse wave to it. In this case, right, this is going to show you ARC the entire range. If you're looking at an ESL speaker, it would really only go to about 400 at max because that's where those are tuned to. So you don't have to apply correction. You can apply correction if you want to, only in the range where it actually could be helpful as well. So kind of neat for that. And that just shows you when we apply that inverse curve, kind of how close we can get to correcting that. You might say, well, Brandon, that's not exactly perfect. That being said, most of our studies on human hearing indicate that people can really only hear a difference if it exceeds 2 decibels. And all of those are within about a decibel to a half a dB in terms of it. So that will drastically sound, or will sound drastically improved, I should say.
Can I just ask a quick question, Brandon?
Yeah,
And apologies
certainly.
if I'm jumping ahead here. So, which of the ranges of Martin Logan products can Anthem room correction be applied to? Because it's presumably not all.
That's correct. Yeah. So with our basically it'll be the Masterpiece series exclusively and
Mm.
anything that's hybrid powered. So anything above a Classic 9. So to kind of show you that here quickly as well too. Thank you for the lead in on that. So
There we
on our
go.
Masterpiece series, you're going to see the Classic 9 ESL. That one's a little bit chunkier in terms of its top end. That's going to be the only passive speaker in the series, and the Neolith. The Neolith, and so essentially our entry level and our very top end predate the room correction essentially, or they won't have room correction included in them.
Yeah,
You get into anything that has an A after the number, 11A, 13A, 15A, those are amplified bottom, essentially, the woofer modules. So
hmm
they will actually have that correction built in for you as well.
Makes sense. All right, thanks.
Yeah. So no worries. So kind of just keeping going with you here quickly for you. So I want to just quickly talk about the model types for you too. Neolith is kind of our biggest guy in terms of it. This is our real showpiece. They're particularly impressive in terms of what you can do with them. So overall, the largest size of panel we're going to have a 15-inch rear ported woofer and a 12-inch front firing sealed mid-bass woofer. So we kind of have more speciality in that regard. Again, this is completely passive, and it has specifically different crossover setups depending on how you're trying to use it. So a lot of customization in that product. One kind of neat thing to mention on these guys too, these are all built entirely out of phalonic material. So I know that you guys might be wondering, well, what is phalonic, or did he mispronounce something? Phalonic material is actually the same thing that's used in essentially like a billiard ball. So it's incredibly dense and incredibly hard overall. So Very low in terms of resonance for it, very, very stiff. So these are a pretty interesting panel overall. At 22-inch wide, it's our widest panel. So when we talk about Renaissance as 15A, Impressions 13A, 13 or 15 is the actual width of the panel. The way it works essentially when you go through the ESL range, additionally, that is the bigger the panel, it doesn't necessarily mean it changes the crossover points or anything like that. It's just easier for it to do the job. Again, it's kind of the idea of if you go through to, to steal the Formula One analogy, right? I had earlier, they made Formula One go down to four-cylinder turbocharged, which worked fine. They can still go very quickly and everything like that, but they have to work much, much harder. Where if you go back to, a V12 engine or something like that, it doesn't have to work as hard. You can get more out of it easily in that regard. So it's a bit more nuanced as well. So generally, as you go through the range, you're going to find that your bass plays a little lower based on the larger woofer configurations. And you're going to find that overall detail improves in clarity, which is saying something because even the entry level pieces in Electromotion are pretty revealing. So to quickly just talk about a little bit about the differences in size, right? We had basically 1,056 square inches of area on that neolith. We go down to a Renaissance at 15 inches wide, and then it's 690. So quite a drastic drop off in terms of size. That being said, that's an impressive speaker. So I'm just shy of 6'8". That one's almost 6.5 feet tall in terms of it. So from an overall standpoint, you'll notice most of them are raked slightly backwards. That one is completely full front, full standing straight. The benefit of that is that it can do so, and we don't actually lose anything in terms of vertical sweet spot. Even someone my height can generally stand up on that and not lose any sound. In the case of the woofers on that, right, you're going to see in terms of the differences of the low frequency woofers. So two 12s on that, two 10s on the 13, two 8s on the Expression, and then two 8s on the Classic 9 as well. We also do have hybrid amplified center channels as well. So you look at that Illusion, for example, and that has anthem room correction for the bass. It's a floor seating center. And then it has a 34-inch wide panel, which has about 276 square inches. And that's augmented with an FMT tweeter built into it as well to kind of make sure we can cover that full range. Power will vary depending on the products. Obviously, you can kind of see the differences in terms of that as we go higher up, obviously, and bigger woofer. We need more power in that regard. And then as mentioned, it'll show you the options that are arc ready. On the Masterpiece lineup, it's going to be everything except the Classic 9 and the Focus ESL C18. The C18 center is an electrostatic center as well. It also has an FMT built into it as well. A little smaller overall, but one of the neat things on that is it is more stand mountable and it's actually wall mountable as well. So if a customer is looking for a specific aesthetic, that's a great option for you in addition. One thing I did want to mention too that comes up a lot with ESLs is placement. Because it's a traditional dipole speaker, you do want to make sure you keep it, further from the wall. But just like any speaker, you generally need to keep the front panel at least 2.5 feet from the back wall. In the case of our products, we've done some unique things. The actual woofer module itself will provide quite a bit of distance for you from the wall, so you can't quite, kind of wall load the panel itself. Addition to that, because we have a front firing and a back firing woofer on most of the units, um, all the powered ones will use an option. It's called powered force forward. So what this means is that we have actually engineered a crossover so that it adjusts phase on the back speaker, so it knows what to expect from that wall bounce. So that's kind of a neat thing. So when you're doing that, we just recommend from a placement option that whatever the size of the woofer is, you keep that at least distance from the back of the cabinet itself. So in the case of a Renaissance, you'd want to be 12 inches from the back of your wall, and then plus the additional distance of the cabinet, and then you're pretty much set up perfectly. Expressions, you're going to have 10 inches, Impressions 8, Classics 8, and so forth and so on. And then finally, talk a little bit about our Electromotion series too. So kind of where our legendary electrostatic sound begins. This is kind of more of our entry-level price point. So while the other previous models are all manufactured in Mississauga, Ontario, in terms of it, and originally were designed and engineered there, originally built in Lawrence, Kansas, but had shifted since. Our ESL Electromotion panels, even on these guys, the panels themselves are all still produced in Mississauga. So kind of a nice thing in terms of that in today's kind of interesting trading situations. That as an action. The cabinets themselves are produced overseas, and then we kind of assemble them final assembly in Canada. The reason we do that is it takes a lot of expertise to be able to pull that material so there's no crinks or creases in it. So generally the way it works, even at the PML facility where they're built, is that kind of people work their way up to the MartinLogan line, right? We don't want someone who's new kind of doing that. we have a series of jigs and things too to kind of give people about 90% of the way. And then there's individuals who will come through and who will actually basically double check by hand each one of the panels, all vacuum seal them, all that kind of stuff. So it is a very much more a labor intensive process when we're talking about building a product like this. And it is really a hand built product in that regard. So we have our ESLXs, our ESLs, and our EFX, which is an on-wall variant. Those can actually be mounted onto the wall, and they have the ability to pivot slightly on a hinge, so you can actually get more directionality if the customer wants an entirely ESL-based system. And then our ESLC, which is a hybrid center channel. Again, it does have an electrostatic panel on it, and then an FMT tweeter in the middle as well. When we look at an ESLX and an ESL, the big difference is in terms of the difference in size. The width of the panel stays the same. You're getting extra height. So a little bit more height in terms of that, a little bit more square surface area. You're also getting two woofers as opposed to one when you look at the regular ESL. And then other than that, you can kind of see the panel sizes tend to differ as we go from there. And then finally, I just wanted to kind of quickly touch on that folded motion that we talk about and the tweeters themselves. So we did want to use a material that was similar to the ESL. Electrostatics is kind of where our heart is and where the history of our company is. That being said, though, we wanted to make sure we could engineer solutions for everyone. So we did end up using an FMT or a folded motion tweeter. Prior to this, these used to be called air motion transformers or an AMT. We've just kind of since been able to develop our own version of it. And essentially, it works in the same way. We talk about an area where the tweeter diaphragm in this case has significantly more size than you would get off something like a traditional dome tweeter. Usually, when you pull apart one of our FMTs, they're anywhere between 5 times to 17 times more square area than a traditional 1-inch dome tweeter. Additional to that, too, because of the way we set them up, they are a magnetic field in this case, but they're a much more controlled magnetic field because we're squeezing as opposed to asking it to move forward or backwards. So because of that, it's a little bit more control in that regard too. And it's just a way we kind of achieve that matting of our technologies so we can produce a center channel that is adequate and not just gimmicky in that regard, right? We want something that performs just as well as our traditional ESL left and right channels so the customer gets that great experience across their entire front soundstage. And with that, guys, apologies. I went a little over on us here today, so I'll wrap it up there. If anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to take them quickly if they do pop up here.
Oh, thank you, Brandon. Yeah, not at all. I think yeah, that was really good. You squeezed it in just for the benefit of everyone else on the call. I think I was a little bit last minute in telling Brandon that he had a half-hour slot to fit into. So yeah, thank you for going quickly. Any questions, anyone? Think we're good. I wonder, would it be possible, your presentation, there are a couple
Mhm.
of the little animations in there that would be quite useful for one of my presentations that we're currently going around doing with Richer Sounds on the foundation range for
Mhm.
FMT type stuff. Would it be possible to get a copy of that?
Yeah, for sure. I'll be happy to send you all that information for it. I think everything I have there too. I think I got all the pricing and stuff stripped out for you if I remember. So, but yeah, so I'd be more than happy to send that for you, and I have some other stuff too. So, Kier, I'll talk to you offline if you want, and
Yeah.
then I can provide you with the animations. I have some other stuff too that you can grab from the new sub range and stuff like that. Yeah, and just a couple things just to end on too, guys. Again, it's challenging to fit all that into a small thing, especially if you're not familiar with ESL. But because of the way ESLs work too, and this is one thing I always like to point out, they're incredibly transparent, incredibly detailed. So no matter what you read online, that's going to be your first thing. People always talk about this panel magic idea that you can always usually remember the first time you heard of MartinLogan. I remember myself. I mentioned before I'm kind of rather tall, so I was absolutely blown away at how they sounded. Then I stood up and the sound kind of went away for me. In the cases though, for a lot of customers' homes, that's kind of neat in today's environment, right? You're not sending sound in areas otherwise. So if you have customers who are in condos, townhomes, things like that, they still want a great hi-fi system that provides amazing output, but doesn't interact with the room or kind of annoy the neighbors. It's a great option for it in that regard as well too. So yeah, I just like to kind of point that stuff out and just kind of say that the way that dispersion works is very unique. Another aspect for them too, and you can try this as well, is if you're a retailer, right? We all want to sell cabling and accessories. Nothing does a better job of showcasing the difference that things like that can make than an ESL because it can showcase that additional resolution and transparency. So if you play around with that stuff in your own place, feel free to try it a little bit and see what you notice. Because I have guys that will that have entire systems based off of different cabling configurations on different products to be able to sell up and down through the range.